Ever get that feeling? Like what we call reality is maybe a bit more bizarre than we usually think about. Like there's this whole other level of stuff going on right under our noses, right under what we normally see and hear.
Like kind of mind-bending territory. That's exactly what we're all about here on the Deep Dive. And today, we're going deep, really deep, into some truly fascinating stuff that you, our listeners, sent our way. We're talking big, big questions about consciousness, how we perceive the world around us or think we perceive it, the whole slippery idea of free will, and the ever-changing world of AI, artificial intelligence. And all of this is coming from a document with a title that pretty much sums it up. Reality is stranger than you think. Consciousness, Perception, Free Will, AI.pdf.
And to help us navigate this seriously dense intellectual jungle, we are so excited to welcome A. K. Harris. A. Carrick, you're the New York Times bestselling author of Conscious, a brief guide to the fundamental mystery of the mind. It's an amazing read, really clear and concise, but it makes you think, really think. And you're also the creator of the upcoming podcast documentary series Lights On, which dives into the bleeding edge of neuroscience, meditation, and the philosophy of mind. Anik, it is such a pleasure to have you with us for this deep dive.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
We are just so excited to pick your brain about all these weird, strange, mind-blowing aspects of consciousness and what they could mean for how we see ourselves and literally everything around us. So, Anik, to kick things off, how about we start with a basic definition? When we talk about consciousness here, what exactly are we talking about? It's one of those words that can mean so many different things to different people.
That is such a crucial first step.
Right.
So often when people hear the word consciousness, they automatically jump to complex thoughts, self-awareness, things like that. Things we typically associate with being human. But the way I think about it, the real heart of this whole mystery is something much more fundamental. It's about felt experience, that raw, basic sense of what it's like to exist.
Felt experience.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. Let's dig a little deeper into what that actually means.
Sure. Think about a bee, right? Just a bee bumping into a flower, or picture a worm moving through the soil. They probably have some kind of very, very basic level of consciousness, even if it's just a simple feeling of pressure. When a simple organism like that moves towards something that's going to nourish it, there's probably some kind of fundamental feeling of hunger that's motivating that action. Even something as small as the impulse to move away from danger, that could be a super rudimentary form of felt experience. Neuroscientists are still trying to figure out just how far consciousness extends in these simpler systems. But this basic sense of what it's like to be that organism, that's what I'm talking about when I say consciousness at its core. It's the sheer fact of having an experience, any kind of experience. It's the difference between, say, processing light waves bouncing off this microphone and actually seeing it. Like I'm not just processing those light waves. I'm seeing its color, its shape. I'm having this internal subjective experience of it. And that feels completely different from how a computer might analyze the same visual data.
Gotcha. So when we talk about sentience, awareness, are we basically using those terms interchangeably with this idea of felt experience for our conversation here?
Yeah, for our purposes today, think of sentience, awareness, felt experience. They're all getting at the same basic capacity, that fundamental ability to have any kind of sensation, that possibility of subjective experience.
This makes me think of that famous thought experiment. What is it like to be a bat?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's from the philosopher Thomas Nagel. And it really nails this idea of how personal, how subjective conscious experience truly is. A bat experiences the world through sonar. It's a sense that's so incredibly different from our own vision-heavy experience. So we can try to intellectually understand what it might feel like to experience the world through echolocation, through sound, but we can never truly know it in the same way a bat does. And there's this great German word, Umwelt, which captures this idea of each organism's unique sensory world. Our human welt is totally different from a bat's welt, which is different from, say, a dog's welt, where smell is so dominant. Each creature is basically living in its own little subjective sensory reality.
Okay, so we're talking about this fundamental subjective felt experience. Now, this naturally leads us to what's often called the hard problem of consciousness. What makes this so hard?
Right. The philosopher David Chalmers coined that term, the hard problem, though people have been wrestling with this underlying puzzle for centuries. Chalmers contrasts it with what he calls the easy problems of neuroscience. Now, I'm not saying these easy problems are actually easy. They're incredibly complex.
Yeah.
But they're all about figuring out which brain states consistently happen when someone is having a particular conscious experience, what scientists call the neural correlates of consciousness. And we're making progress in finding these connections between what's going on in the brain and what people are experiencing. But the hard problem, it's a completely different beast, it asks. Why is there any felt experience at all associated with what's happening in the brain? Or with any kind of activity, for that matter? Why aren't we just incredibly complex biological machines processing information without any inner life, without any feeling, without any experience whatsoever? Why is there this movie playing in our heads?
It really does cut right to the chase, doesn't it? Why this inner world? Why this feeling of experience?
Exactly. And for some people, that mystery is just immediately, obviously, there. But for others, it takes a little more effort to grasp what the puzzle even is. But when you start comparing our human experience to other systems, AI, plants, even insects, the question really starts to take shape. Intuitively, we suspect that these other systems, even though they might have some really complex behaviors, might not actually have this inner felt experience. Like a sophisticated AI might be able to understand language, write stories, even compose music, but do we really think it feels anything while it's doing that? It seems natural to assume that humans, and maybe other mammals, do have this inner life. But figuring out the fundamental difference that explains why some processing is accompanied by experience and other processing isn't, that's the essence of the hard problem. The big takeaway here is that science can explain how the brain works, how it processes information, but not why we have this subjective experience of it all.
And it seems like science, in its purest form, with its focus on external observation, might just be inherently limited when it comes to tackling this, right?
You're right on the money there. Science, and even just our everyday way of making sense of the world, relies on studying things from the outside in. We observe behavior. We look at physical properties. Now, luckily, with other humans, we have this incredibly complex system of communication. We can talk to each other, share our experiences, and that gives us a pretty good, though imperfect, sense of each other's inner lives. Because we're similar enough, we have a common ground for understanding feelings, we have a shared language for it all. But at the end of the day, I can never directly experience your experience, just like you can't directly experience mine. And this problem gets even harder when we think about organisms that are very different from us. Imagine trying to explain the feeling of seeing, of color, to someone who's been blind from birth. Analogies and metaphors can only take you so far.
So this brings us to one of the fundamental questions that you explore in your book. Can we ever truly definitively prove from the outside, just by looking at something, that it has consciousness?
Exactly. That's the first big question I wanted to tackle in the book. And it's a question that really challenges our deepest intuitions about consciousness. Because intuitively, we feel like the answer is a big, fat yes, especially when it comes to other humans and maybe other mammals. But the reality is, with our current scientific understanding, particularly in neuroscience, it's actually impossible to prove for sure. As we've been talking about, all we really have to go on is behavior, things we can observe, and communication, if that's possible. But behavior alone, it's not a foolproof indicator.
And you use the example of locked-in syndrome in the book, right? It's such a powerful example of how outward appearance and inner experience can be so different.
Exactly. Locked-in syndrome, which is usually caused by damage to specific parts of the brain, it's this really strange condition where a person is completely paralyzed, completely unable to move, but their consciousness is completely intact. Now, from the outside, someone in a locked-in state looks unconscious. They can't move, they can't communicate. But we know now that many of these individuals are having a full, rich, conscious experience. They can see, hear, think, feel everything happening around them, but they just have no way to express it. This just shows how big the gap can be between how something looks on the outside and what's actually going on inside, subjectively. And it really emphasizes how hard it is to determine for sure whether something is conscious just by looking at it from the outside.
That's a really heavy, thought-provoking example for sure. So what's the second key question you explore?
The second question, it's closely related to the first, and it kind of looks at our intuitions from a slightly different angle. It asks, is consciousness actually doing anything? Like, is it really the thing that's driving our behavior? Like, we feel so strongly that it is. Is this felt experience, this inner world, is it the thing that's actually causing us to act in the world?
And again, our first gut-level reaction is probably a resounding yes.
You got it. We feel so strongly that our thoughts, our feelings, our intentions, that all comes from our conscious minds, and that's what's causing us to do what we do. But just like with the first question, When we start to really dig into the evidence, the support for this intuition isn't quite as rock solid as we might think.
I was thinking about that earlier, like just waking up and getting ready to have this conversation with you. It felt so clearly like it was my conscious intention to get ready that made me actually do it.
Exactly. It feels almost impossible to imagine doing all those things without being aware of them, without consciously choosing to do them. But there are areas of neuroscience that are really starting to challenge that assumption, that deep-seated intuition. Let's take fear, for example.
Fear, yeah, it's a pretty primal emotion, one that seems to just take over and dictate what we do, especially in those fight or flight situations.
Right, totally. If you suddenly come across something dangerous, that feeling of fear, it seems like that's the thing that triggers that whole fight or flight response. But when you look at what's going on in the brain at a deeper level, the conscious experience of fear is actually one of the last things to happen.
Mm.
Our bodies are actually reacting to potential threats way, way faster. We're talking 300 to 500 milliseconds. That's less than half a second. Our nervous system is already detecting danger and starting that whole physical response before we even consciously register the feeling of fear. There's a neuroscientist, David Eagleman, who talks about this idea that we're actually living slightly in the past because of all the time it takes for the brain to process sensory information and weave it all together. He talks about these things called binding processes.
Binding processes, what are those?
So binding processes, they're basically how the brain takes all this sensory information, sight, sound, touch, all that, and integrates it all into a single coherent experience. But the thing is, different types of sensory information, they travel at different speeds and take different amounts of time to process. So the brain has to do all this behind-the-scenes work to bind everything together so we experience it all as happening simultaneously. Eagleman gives this great example of the starting blocks at a race. Like, if you're standing at the starting blocks and you hear the starting pistol, your brain actually processes that sound faster than it processes the light from the flash of the gun.
So even though they happen at the same time, we actually hear it before we see it.
Exactly. And because sound gets processed faster, we actually react faster to sounds than we do to visual cues. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, too. It's more important to react quickly to a sudden rustle in the bushes, which could be a predator, than it is to react quickly to seeing something move. So all this is happening unconsciously, milliseconds before we even have the conscious experience of what's going on. Like, think about playing tennis. You see the ball, you feel the racket hit it, you hear the sound of the impact, all seemingly at the same time. But in reality, those different sensory inputs are all arriving at your brain at slightly different times, and your brain is binding them together to give you this seamless experience of the present moment.
So what you're saying is that our bodies are already reacting, making decisions even, before our conscious mind even catches up.
Pretty much, yeah. It's kind of like our conscious experience is always playing catch-up, always slightly behind the curve of what's already happening in our bodies.
That's a pretty wild realization, isn't it? How has that understanding, how has knowing this, how has it changed how you operate? It's kind of unsettling, realizing that your experience is the last to know, as you put it earlier.
It can definitely be destabilizing.
Yeah.
Like the first time you really grasp it, it can make you feel a little uneasy, for sure. I've been there. But I think it's really important to also recognize that this understanding can have some really positive psychological effects, too. It can shift your perspective in some pretty profound ways.
In what ways? Like, how has it shifted your perspective?
Well, for one thing, it could really help you feel more connected to everything, less like you're this solid, isolated self. This ties into the whole idea of the illusion of a solid self, which you've talked about on previous deep dives, right? When you start to really understand how the brain works, how our physiology works, it starts to reveal that this feeling we have of being this fixed, unchanging entity moving through time all on our own, it's more of a useful mental construct than a true reflection of reality. And realizing that can be kind of uncomfortable at first. Like, wait, what do you mean there's no solid me? But in the long run, I think it can lead to a greater sense of oneness, a feeling of interconnectedness, and even a sense of inner freedom. It can actually reduce the amount of psychological suffering we experience. That suffering that comes from feeling fundamentally separate and alone. Because you start to see how deeply intertwined we are with everything else.
That really resonates with me. I remember you mentioning that you'd love to have some kind of visual representation of this interconnectedness. Like, if we could actually see it, it would change everything.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I often imagine how different our experience would be if we could actually see the sound waves of our voices, like literally interacting with the air between us. Or if we could see the air we're breathing flowing in and out of each other, this constant, subtle exchange we're having with the environment all the time. I think that would cultivate a much stronger, more visceral sense that we're not just separate beings in nature. We are nature.
Mm. Now, let's shift gears a little bit. A lot of people have this really strong intuitive sense that consciousness, or some form of it, exists in other living things, particularly plants and fungi. We hear about trees communicating with each other, the huge, complex networks of mycelium underground. What are your thoughts on that?
It's fascinating how powerful these intuitions can be. Like you mentioned, feeling that trees have some form of consciousness. Interestingly, my own initial intuition actually went the other way. I never really felt strongly that plants were conscious. But I've been reading a lot about the latest research on plant behavior, and it's really started to challenge those initial assumptions I held.
So, you're saying we can't always trust our gut feelings, our intuitions in these matters.
Exactly. And intuition, it's basically a feeling that something is true. But that feeling, it doesn't automatically equal accurate information about the world. The astrophysicist Sarah Walker, she recently said on social media that intuitions are our best guide as scientists. And, my first reaction to that was, well, there's some truth to that, but unfortunately, they can also be our worst guide sometimes. I mean, think about it. So much of scientific progress has come from directly challenging our most cherished intuitions, like accepting that the Earth is a sphere, not flat, or trying to wrap our heads around the fact that there's this whole microscopic world we can't even see with our naked eyes. Our intuitions can, and often do, change quite dramatically when we're presented with compelling new evidence, new information that challenges those old ways of thinking.
And that kind of intellectual understanding, it's not always necessary to have that, to actually feel a sense of connection with something, is it?
No, not at all. You can have this incredibly powerful, deeply felt experience of interconnectedness, of oneness, without needing to have a complete intellectual grasp of all the science and philosophy behind it. There's a quote by the Indian philosopher Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj that I think speaks to this. He said, "The search for reality is the most dangerous of all undertakings, for it destroys the world in which you live." But I see that destruction not as a bad thing, but as a necessary opening. It allows us to see this much bigger, more expansive horizon.
So, coming back to plants and fungi, when we see these complex behaviors they exhibit, how do you interpret them in terms of consciousness? How are you thinking about it these days?
Honestly, my initial interest in plant behavior actually came from this underlying sense that plants probably weren't conscious, at least not in the way we typically think about it. And I was really curious to see if they exhibited any behaviors that seemed analogous to things we often associate with consciousness in animals, like, for example, parental care. We might not use the word love to describe what plants do, but the behaviors themselves, they could be remarkably similar in some cases. Now, historically, plant research, it's suffered from a bit of pseudoscience. But there's been this huge resurgence of really solid, scientifically rigorous research in recent years. I was reading the work of plant biologist Daniel Chamovitz, and I learned that we actually share a surprisingly significant amount of DNA with plants, like even genes related to light detection, which suggests that we share some very fundamental biological building blocks for certain types of behavior. So yes, plants definitely show complex behaviors. They respond to their environment in sophisticated ways. But that doesn't automatically mean they have the kind of rich intersubjective experience that we usually associate with consciousness.
So, given that it's basically impossible to get definitive proof that something other than ourselves is conscious just by looking at it from the outside, what do you think is the best way to try to figure out whether an intelligent life form might have that inner experience?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it really highlights why the study of consciousness is so important, so crucial. Neuroscience is still a relatively young field, and we're really just starting to understand the incredible complexity of the brain. But as we've been discussing, there's this fundamental obstacle to studying consciousness using the traditional scientific method, which relies on this third-person objective observation. However, I do think we're on the verge of a major shift in the sciences, maybe even a paradigm shift like we've seen throughout history, that will allow us to develop better ways of understanding consciousness in all its forms. What exactly that shift will look like, it's hard to say. But I'm optimistic that new, more effective approaches will emerge.
This whole deeper exploration of consciousness, it raises some really big ethical questions too, especially when we think about things like animal agriculture and the potential for suffering in beings whose inner lives we might be totally underestimating.
Yeah, absolutely. If consciousness is more widespread in the natural world than we currently think, then it becomes even more important to try to understand suffering. Like, what does it actually mean to suffer? And where does it actually exist in nature? Unfortunately, the way life on Earth works, it often involves competition for resources, survival of the fittest, and that inevitably leads to some degree of suffering, at least at the animal level. There's this really disturbing example in Zoe Schlenger's book, The Light Eaters, about these cannibalistic caterpillars. And their behavior, it's actually triggered by this chemical that a certain plant releases. It's a stark reminder of how complex and sometimes brutal the dynamics in nature can be. And it really forces us to confront our own ethical responsibility, our role in potentially reducing suffering when we become aware of it. And this line of thinking, it doesn't have to stop at animals. We could even consider the potential experiences of other forms of life, like parasites and viruses, which adds even more layers of complexity to the whole conversation.
You've talked about how your own meditation practice has made you more sensitive to the presence of life around you.
It has, yeah. Through meditation, through just trying to be more present when I'm walking in nature, I've definitely felt a deepening of my own sense of connection to everything around me, and also a stronger sense of wanting to minimize harm whenever possible. The yogic system, for example, describes these different levels of mind going beyond just the intellectual level. It suggests that there are deeper levels of intelligence that can tap into this direct, intuitive knowing of interconnectedness. And I think meditation can play a role in shifting our intuitions about consciousness, about our relationship to the world. There's even this concept in Buddhism called non-conceptual valid cognition. And that refers to a kind of intuitive knowing that comes through our body, through our felt experience, not just our intellect. For me personally, just being open to the possibility that consciousness might be this fundamental aspect of reality, it's already led to new questions, a whole different way of seeing the world.
This brings us to a really interesting debate. Is consciousness ultimately something that emerges from more basic unconscious processes? Or is it actually a fundamental building block of the universe itself? Can you unpack those two contrasting views for us?
Sure. So the traditional view in science has been that consciousness is what we call an emergent property. It arises from a certain level of complexity in the organization of matter, like all the intricate activity happening in the human brain, even though the underlying matter itself isn't conscious. But there's another perspective that's been getting more attention lately, and that's the idea that consciousness might be fundamental, like it's just built into the fabric of the universe, as basic as space, time, gravity.
You've mentioned before that you're not a huge fan of the term panpsychism. Can you tell us why?
Panpsychism, broadly speaking, it refers to this idea that consciousness or mind-like qualities are fundamental, that they exist to some degree in everything in the universe. But personally, I'm not crazy about the term. It has some baggage from older philosophical debates, from a time when our understanding of the universe was very different. And that panpsychism at the end, it makes it sound like a rigid belief system. Whereas I see this question as consciousness more fundamental than we currently think, as a really open, active, incredibly important scientific question that we need to be exploring.
Why do you think the traditional scientific view has tended to favor this idea of consciousness as an emergent property? What's the thinking behind that?
I think it's largely because the most direct way we know about consciousness is through firsthand reports, people telling us what they're experiencing. And historically, those reports have mostly come from beings very similar to us other humans. So it's understandable that scientists have assumed that consciousness is probably linked to really complex systems like brains, but that's where we have the clearest confirmation that it exists, because people can talk about it. But, and this is important, even when we're dealing with other humans, it can be really hard to communicate about completely new experiences. Like, remember that study we talked about earlier where people were given the ability to sense magnetic north?
Oh, yeah, that was fascinating.
Right. They could develop this sense of magnetic north, but they really struggled to describe what it actually felt like. And that was with other humans. This suggests that there could be all sorts of conscious experiences happening even within our own species that we just don't have the capacity to recognize, understand, or communicate about effectively with our current methods. Just like we've come to realize that we're not the center of the universe, that we're not made of fundamentally different stuff than everything else, it's a valid question to ask. Could consciousness also be a more basic aspect of reality? Like maybe it's more like gravity, which seems to affect everything in the universe.
You mentioned that magnetic north study, and it made me think about how amazingly adaptable the brain is, like what we see in the research on sensory addition and substitution.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing, isn't it? David Eagleman and other researchers have shown just how flexible the brain really is, like how it can adapt to completely new types of sensory input. For example, there's this device called BrainPort, and it uses electrotactile signals on the tongue to create a kind of vision for people who are blind. It's incredible. The brain learns to make sense of this totally foreign sensory information, and it does it in a way that feels intuitive. It usually takes about 6 weeks for the brain to adapt. And people using BrainPort have even learned to do things like shoot basketballs using this new form of vision. It really opens up the possibility that humans could develop all sorts of new senses, new intuitions for information we don't currently perceive at all.
So let's say consciousness is fundamental as gravity. Why would it be that some collections of atoms, like a human brain, seem to have so much more self-awareness than, say, a rock?
That is the central question, isn't it? The big mystery we're still trying to figure out. I don't have a definitive answer yet, but the main idea is that the specific structure of those collections of atoms, or maybe some deeper underlying structure that we don't even understand yet, plays a huge role in creating those more complex forms of conscious experience. I've been developing a way of thinking about the universe where consciousness is fundamental, and it suggests that what we think of as physical matter might actually be more like representations or expressions of conscious experience at its core. Kind of like how when we look at another person, we're taking in all this visual information, their facial expressions, their movements, and it all represents this incredibly rich inner world of thoughts, feelings, sensations. Maybe this same principle applies to all matter. Simpler systems might have more basic rudimentary experiences, while more complex systems have more complex experiences. Memory also seems to be crucial for our sense of self, that feeling of continuity through time. If we didn't have at least a little bit of memory, linking one moment to the next, we probably wouldn't have this sense of a solid me moving through time. So maybe the me we experience is more like a thread of memory woven through this huge sea of countless other conscious experiences that are happening all the time within our own bodies, but that we don't necessarily remember. The really big question then becomes, if consciousness is fundamental, why does it have the specific structures and organization that we see in the universe? Math and physics, they've been incredibly successful at describing these fundamental structures. Maybe the future of science is about understanding why consciousness takes these specific forms, with those structures, described by math and physics, being the most basic elements.
You brought up the example of gravity before, how our understanding of it evolved from Newton's view of it as a force to Einstein's view of it as the warping of space-time.
Exactly. It's like our everyday experience of gravity, that feeling of being pulled down. It was pointing to a much deeper, more fundamental truth about the nature of reality, about space-time itself. And maybe our experience of space and time, it's pointing to something even more fundamental. Maybe space itself isn't truly fundamental, but rather it emerges from something else, something we don't fully grasp yet. And if consciousness is fundamental, then the idea that space is emergent, that it's a kind of mapping our brains create, it starts to make a bit more sense. It also connects to the ideas of physicists like Max Tegmark, who argues that mathematical structures are actually fundamental aspects of reality. Now, that's hard to wrap our heads around with our current understanding of physics. But what if those mathematical structures are actually describing different types of fundamental experiences in a universe where consciousness is the basic building block? This could even relate to the idea of multiple dimensions that comes up in quantum mechanics, which are so hard to reconcile with our everyday experience of three-dimensional space.
It's amazing how these ideas from cutting-edge science, they seem to resonate with some of the ancient wisdom traditions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The idea of a fundamental consciousness, it's a core concept in a lot of Eastern philosophies. They talk about the illusory nature of the self, the limitations of free will, and they point to this more fundamental aspect of being, often called the witness or pure awareness. And they suggest that understanding this deeply can lead to a profound sense of liberation and freedom, a freedom that's not dependent on the ego, on the idea of a separate self.
So, Anok, if consciousness is as fundamental as you're suggesting, what would you say is the most fundamental aspect of your own nature?
For me, it comes down to those moments of deep stillness when the mind is quiet. There's this sense of presence, of awareness that remains even when there are no specific thoughts, no sensory input. It suggests that this basic awareness, this pure unconditioned capacity for experience, might be the most fundamental thing about me, about all of us.
So, if this is true, if consciousness is fundamental, wouldn't that mean that directly exploring our own first-person experience through things like meditation could give us insights into the nature of reality that we couldn't get through traditional science?
Exactly. Practices like meditation, they're specifically designed to quiet the mind, to explore the nature of experience directly. They could offer a unique and valuable path to understanding reality, a path that complements and maybe even informs traditional science.
Let's talk more about this idea of the illusion of self. What exactly is the illusion here? What are we talking about when we say the self is an illusion?
It's really important to make this clear. When we talk about the illusion of self, it doesn't mean that we don't exist as individuals, or the things we experience in the world aren't real. Think of it like waves in the ocean. Waves are real, they're dynamic, they're constantly changing, but ultimately they're just movements of the underlying water. The illusion is in thinking that the wave is a separate, independent thing. So with the self, the illusion is this feeling we have of being a solid, unchanging, independent entity that moves through time in a straight line. Now, our brains are constantly processing information, creating this sense of continuity, making everything feel coherent. But the self we experience, it's more like that wave constantly changing fluid than it is like a fixed object. Even the way we talk, like saying my brain, my body, it reinforces this idea that we're separate from our physical being. And this feeling of a solid, independent self is also tied to our sense of free will. The feeling that our conscious self is making decisions all on its own, independently of the physical world, independently of cause and effect. But what if consciousness is more like the canvas, the background on which the events of reality, driven by our brain processes, are playing out?
That analogy of the self being like a wave, it's really helpful. And there's actually measurable evidence of this too. Studies have shown that certain brain areas, particularly the default mode network, become less active in deep meditation and in psychedelic experiences, and this correlates with the feeling of the self dissolving.
That's right. And the important thing is that this dissolving of the self, it doesn't mean we're not conscious anymore. We're still fully conscious. But it often leads to really positive experiences. People describe a sense of interconnectedness, of oneness, a feeling of being part of something much bigger. I actually had a really powerful experience of this myself at a silent meditation retreat a few years ago.
Would you mind sharing that experience with us?
Sure. I was doing walking meditation, and suddenly it was like this light bulb went off. Not just an intellectual understanding, but a direct experience. That there was no me doing the walking. There was just the experience itself, the sensations in my feet, the movement of my body all happening on their own. It was like all these conscious experiences, the qualia, the thoughts, the sensations, they were just arising and passing away within the field of consciousness itself. Like bubbles forming and popping in a boiling pot of water, all happening within the same water, without any central self controlling it all. It brought this deep sense of peace, of non-attachment, and a feeling of just witnessing things arising and passing away, is what Buddhists call anicca. And with that came this incredible sense of freedom and a much more direct, intimate connection with the world, without all the usual filters and distortions created by my desires and expectations. It was like taking off a pair of glasses I didn't even know I was wearing. And there was this really strong feeling of oneness, like other beings were just part of that same interconnected web of experience. Not in a narcissistic way, but more like how you might identify with a past version of yourself. It even makes you think about what we might call experiential science. Like, what if in the future we could share memories directly? Would that give us a clearer view of this underlying reality? Would it strengthen our understanding that others are fundamentally similar to ourselves, just experiencing different moments in time?
It sounds like a truly life-changing experience.
It was. It changes how you relate to the world, how you
Wow.
relate to yourself.
Yeah.
It's